In case you missed last week's announcement, you can now support Heavy Hands on Patreon.
If you don't know what Patreon is, it's basically ongoing crowdfunding. Essentially, it's a platform that will allow you, our listeners, to patronize our show in exchange for rewards.
Currently, we have rewards set for monthly pledges of $1, $3, and $5.
You can get your name read on the show or posted on the Heavy Hands website, and you can even get a guaranteed spot in the Heavy Bag, our listener mail segment.
If you'd like to donate more than that per month, we're open to discussing other rewards, including custom scouting work and fight analysis.
We've enjoyed bringing you all the finer points of face punching for the last year, and we look forward to doing so for a long time yet.
Please help us cover our production costs and keep the show running smoothly each and every week. Check out Heavy Hands on Patreon.com. I'm Connor Rebush, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush. With me, as always, is Patrick Wyman, and we are here today to discuss the MMA phenomenon, probably the biggest star in the sport right now, one of the few MMA fighters in the past, I want to say decade maybe, who has legitimately broken through as a mainstream attraction. I'm speaking, of course, about Ronda Rousey, who will be facing Holly Holm at the upcoming UFC 193 next weekend. What's that date? November?
That is the 14th.
November 14th, 2015. And we've talked about Rousey on the show before, but Holm is an interesting opponent. She's one of the few opponents that Rousey has faced who I think you could say is a completely finished product. I don't think we're going to be seeing many more progressions from Holm in the future. I think she's found her footing as a fighter, and we know kind of exactly what to expect from her, whether it's boxing or MMA. And so that makes it an interesting fight. She's also kind of a unique stylist. Obviously, the judo versus boxing angle has been played up a lot, so we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of that and try to assess whether or not that is an accurate representation of the fight. Before we get to that, though, I want to thank our $5 sponsors from Patreon. You guys know, because you heard the little blurb at the beginning of today's episode, that Heavy Hands is now on Patreon. These are people who have pledged at the $3 level or above. In fact, all of these people from the month of October have pledged at the $5 level or more. And many of you have not sent us questions yet. So I'm going to tell you how to do that after I give you our thanks. And then for future episodes, I think we'll break up our sponsors from the previous month so that we don't just have to read off a giant long list of your guys' names. You can feel like you're actually being noticed a little bit. But for now, here's everybody who supported us in like the 4 days of Patreon we had during October. So it's fantastic to have so many names to read here. We had Emil Rainberg, who we read a question from last week. Chris Reaney, fantastic artist. Jorge Cabrera, Thomas Grant, I suspect that's our buddy TP Grant. Scott Adkin, Liam Franks, Carl Calmer, Shane Walsh, who pledged $10 rather than $5. So Shane, if you have a suggestion for a reward you'd like to receive for that $10 pledge, please let us know. Justin Wilson, and a mysterious man known only as Owen. So all of you guys who pledged, thank you very much. We really appreciate your support. Please send us a message on Patreon with your question. More than one question would be ideal if you have 2 or 3 things that you would like to have us answer or discuss on the show. That way, if it doesn't happen to fit our purposes, or we don't think it's the kind of thing we talk about typically, or we just can't think of a good way to assess it, we don't have to get back in touch with you asking for another one. Giving us some choices will be pretty much guaranteed to have something to talk about that you want to hear on the heavy bag question. And I think that's just about it for the Patreon stuff. Also, when you guys write in, we do wait until the next month just to make sure that all pledges are confirmed. It's not that we don't trust you. That's just the recommended Patreon policy. So if you have pledged to the show at the start of November and you don't hear your name read out until the first episode of December, it's not because we didn't get your pledge. We do appreciate it. We just wait because that's what Patreon recommends we do. But anyway, from both of us, thank you guys very much. Please send in those questions so we can get to fulfilling your rewards. Pat, today's topic, Ronda Rousey. what more is there to say about Ronda Rousey from a technical perspective, especially when all of her fights have been pretty much under a minute for the last several years?
Yeah, well, there's only so much that you can say about Ronda Rousey. Luckily, there's a lot that we can say about the specific matchup of Ronda Rousey versus Holly Holm, which is an intriguing matchup. It's, we've spent a lot of time on this show over the last year discussing stylistic matchups and discussing types of the precise stylistic tendencies of fighters. And this is a really interesting matchup of either a pressure fighter in Ronda Rousey or potentially a swarmer, depending on how you want to define that, versus the most pure possible example of an outfighter. Holly Holm always wants to be fighting as far on the outside as humanly possible. And not even just at the fringes of punching distance or the fringes of kicking distance. She's another good 4 to 6 inches beyond the furthest fringes of striking distance. She is as far out as you can possibly be and still be in the same cage.
Yeah, absolutely. And often too far out for her own good, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would say that that's a distinct that's a distinct problem with her style. I think that is going to play in her advantage in this particular matchup, though.
Yeah, I think you may be right. So why don't we first discuss Holly Holm as a fighter? Let's try and get at the meat of her style. Fortunately, if you guys are curious to see what Holly Holm looked like as a boxer, and it's really not very dissimilar from what she looks like as a mixed martial artist, the UFC have taken it upon themselves to purchase the rights to a couple of her boxing bouts. And so if you search her name on Fight Pass, you can find her bout with Mary McGee, which was one of her last fights before retiring. And then you can also see her rematch with Anne-Sophie Matisse. I'm sure that they chose to purchase the rematch and not the first fight because the first fight is one of the most brutally drawn-out knockouts I've ever seen. Did she even get knocked out in that fight, or did she just get beaten for several rounds?
I think she just got beaten until eventually it was stopped, right?
The referee did eventually save her, though. But it was a brutal beating, one that a lot of people criticized Mike Winklejohn for not helping her out because it was very hard to watch. Yeah, she got knocked out in the 7th round, and it was at least 2 rounds of savage beating before that happened. The rematch, she did pretty much what I expect her to do against Ronda Rousey, because Matisse, who she was fighting at the time, was bigger and stronger and a harder hitter and an aggressive fighter. And so if you watch that fight, you can get a really good idea of how Holm, when limited to just her hands, fought a fighter like that. It's kind of ugly. And I think that's really kind of the basis of Holm's style. It's just this kind of high work rate, far outside, not landing a lot, but just throwing enough out there to confuse the opponent. Would you say that's a fair summation?
Yeah, I mean, she uses volume not just to score, but to confuse her opponent.
Sure.
And I think that, it's worth noting the difference between how she fights as a boxer and how she fights as an MMA fighter. For despite the great depth of her professional boxing experience, in MMA, she tends to rely very heavily on her kicks. Why? I think it's probably because it gives her a few extra inches of distance to work with. That if your natural tendency is to be as far outside as possible, then why not utilize the longest range tool possible? And not just like Thai style round kicks, but long range front kicks, teeps, and especially the lead leg side kicks. So those are even further out than something like a round kick.
Yeah, and I think her reputation as a boxer has really helped her in utilizing those kicks. Because, I mean, if you think about it, she came into, everybody hears this, she comes into MMA and everyone says, this is arguably the best female boxer on the planet. And that is a fair title for her. She was effective in boxing. The quality of her competition hasn't always been great, but that's just kind of, I mean, you could say the same thing about Ronda Rousey, couldn't you? That's just kind of the state of women's boxing. In most divisions, there's not a lot of depth. And regardless of that, Holm dealt with them all very well. And even the one woman who did beat her, Anne-Sophie Matisse, she came back and beat her in the rematch. It wasn't pretty, but Holm was effective. And so these women in MMA come into their fights with Holm and they say, she's a great boxer. So she's going to be dangerous with her hands. And I think that's what has made her kicks such a dangerous weapon for her, because she's really a far more dangerous kicker than she ever has been a puncher. Because even in boxing, she very rarely knocked anybody out, and it was usually an attritive sort of knockout against a far outmatched opponent. She never had that one-shot power, where with the kicks, there's a more opportunity to put a little body mass into that. And I think you could say about her coach, Mike Winklejohn, that he was probably always a better kicker than a puncher too when he was fighting himself.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the threat. So she's a southpaw. I think we'll get that out there first and foremost. But the threat of her straight left, which was always her bread and butter punch as a boxer, and the threat of her left kicks plays together in neat ways, right? So
Sure.
if you start to slip her straight left, then you duck right into the path of a left high kick. If you keep your head at home so that you're not ducking into the path of the high kick, or you draw your right hand, if you're an orthodox fighter, back to the side of your head to defend against that high kick, which comes early and often, then you're pinning your head in place for the straight left. She knows exactly where your head's going to be when she fires the straight left. Either way, your elbows are going to be up. You're going to be keeping a tight guard to defend either of those strikes. Your body is open. So that's the threat that Holm plays with. It's the threat of the left round kick executed to the body and the head, plus the straight left. That's the basis of her game. That's the meat and potatoes of it. And that's going to be most of the strikes that she throws that are actually trying to hurt you. And she has her distance management strikes too. She has her front kicks, her side kicks, a jab that she throws more often, I think, than I initially realized that she does. But that's her game. That's her bread and butter.
And I think it's a switch up of distance as well, because for Holm, we have distance management. She doesn't want you to get close to her, but she is not a great measurer. She doesn't, even in boxing, when she would be flinging that jab out there, she would often attempt like a lead left hand from about 4 feet away, and not connect more often than not, or connect and have to really lean in to get there just on the end of the punch. She doesn't strike you as a fighter who's happy to stick around in mid-range, and so she'll spend a lot of time getting in from very, very far away. And I think that is part of why the kicks are so effective for her as well. Because more often than not, opponents can just take a step back and get away from her left hand. But while that left hand is still extended, she can keep following through on a kick. And the thing about kicks is you don't really need weight transfer to be a hard kicker. There's not a lot of weight transfer in a kick in general, because for the vast majority of the time, one of your feet is off the ground. Your weight is already all the way on one of your feet, completely committed, more so than it would be ideally when throwing a punch. And so it's really more about generating torque with the body. And so for Holm, who has always struggled to get weight transfer into her punches, which is one of the primary ways of putting pop in your hands, she actually can be very effective when the opponent steps back by just following with that kick, and it has more time to accelerate, and it's very sneaky because the opponents are usually worried about that left hand. She's covering all this distance anyway. They take a step back, maybe they loosen their guard as they feel they're getting out of range, and they get cracked on the jaw. That's what happened in her last fight, I think, before coming into the UFC. I can't remember the name of her opponent at the moment.
Was it Juliana Werner? Or?
Yeah, it may have been. That sounds right. And she cracked her with the left high kick as she was stepping back away from the left hand. Head straight up in the air, didn't slip into it or anything, but just tried to create some space. And that was it. And that makes her pretty dangerous. And she can kick to the body as well. All of this relies on her being out of range. And obviously I think most would agree that that's a good idea against Ronda Rousey, who we all know she wants it in the clinch or as close to the clinch as possible. She's got the good clinch striking. She's got the judo, obviously. And she's happy to just square up and fling 1-2s over and over and over, classic Vitor Belfort style, like she did when she knocked out Bethe Correia.
Yeah, what makes this an intriguing matchup is the distance aspect of it, right? It's that Holm wants to be so far out and Rousey wants to be all the way inside. Yeah. I mean, not only are those Rousey's preferred ranges, as far as we can tell, she doesn't have any tools from further out than that. None. We have seen nothing resembling a kicking game from her.
It's true.
She doesn't, as far as we can tell, she doesn't have. I mean, we've only seen it in brief flashes, but she doesn't appear to be a great cage cutter. She doesn't appear to have great cage cutting footwork at this point. So if somebody is bound and determined to stay away from her, we haven't seen a whole lot from Rousey to suggest that she's got an array of tools for dealing with that.
And typically, she just runs forward into the fighter. Even as she has grown more confident in her striking, it's still a barely refined version of that classic approach. It's the Rousey bull rush, you could call it.
Yeah, she's a freight train.
Yeah.
And that works for her. Everything about that freight train analogy works because she's so big and she's so strong and she's so fast that she doesn't need to worry about the kinds of refined technical niceties, or at least has not to this point needed to worry about those things.
And it seems like she can take a shot as well.
Yeah, because she has everything you need to make that work. If you're so fast and you're fighting opponents who, frankly, if we're being honest about it, are not as athletic, are nowhere close to being as athletically gifted as she is, that there's no way that they can run fast enough backwards or circle laterally enough to get away from her if they have any hope of being in range to hurt her.
Yeah.
Right? Like Kat Zingano is the best athlete that she's faced, and Zingano obliged her by running directly at her at the start of the fight.
Most of the fighters who can athletically match her to some degree want to trade with her. They're aggressive
or
themselves.
like Sarah McMahon, or they want to operate in the same ranges that she wants to operate at.
Yeah. So Holm will really be the first opponent who is not only we expect. I can't imagine that Holm is going to try to clinch with Rousey. So unless something insane happens, Holm will be the only opponent to date who will not only be completely determined to stay away from Rousey, but capable of doing so, who has a lot of experience fighting that type of fight. So how do we see this one playing out?
Well, so I think it's going to be real ugly. Like that's my prediction for this fight, that it's going to be ugly.
My thoughts here are, thank God Ioana Jedrzejczyk is fighting before this fight.
Yeah, I mean, I with all of that said, I mean, I think that this is Rousey's fight to lose, and even if it plays out entirely on the feet, I think Holm's lack of power and her lack of real tools to hurt her opponent, because her kicks are mostly annoying against high level competition. They're not truly lethal tools.
Sure.
And because, I was going to say this earlier, but even as a kicker, she's not terribly devastating.
No, she's like Carlos Condit, right? If he catches you clean, it's going to hurt, but really it's like a volume kind of thing.
Yeah, she's got really strong hips, but I wouldn't say she's got really fluid hips. Nobody's going to confuse her with one of the Pettis brothers,
Sure.
So I think her tendency to be so far outside means that she's not going to be able to land a whole lot. But it is going to make it hard for Rousey to get the fight into spaces where she can really win it. The boos are going to rain down, and that's how Holm is going to know that she's in the right spot to win it. But eventually, Rousey's going to get her hands on her, and she's going to get her down, and Holm's not going to be able to escape. I think it'll take a while. Like, Holm is not a bad clinch fighter at all.
No, she's not. She's probably one of the better clinch fighters that Rousey has faced.
Yeah, and she's really good, not just at fighting in the clinch, but getting out of the clinch. She excels at breaking the clinch, landing shots in the transitions, and immediately reestablishing her distance and her space, getting out to the middle where she wants to be.
So here's what I think happens. I think Holm, as we've said before, bound and determined to stay away from Rousey. I think one of her major difficulties doing that is going to be that she is not a great pot shotter in terms of landing what my colleague Dallas Winston has called back-off strikes. She's not the type of fighter to plant her feet at the right moment and sit down on a 1-2 and then take an angle, and so that by the time you stop flinching from being hit, you realize she's behind you. She doesn't have that kind of ability to run you into strikes consistently. She has done that so before, of course, but her problem, I think, her real problem here is that her method of punching has her flinging her weight forward. It's the only way she knows to generate enough pop to make someone respect her punches. And because most of her weight is on her front foot already, which is just fine for a kicker, a lot of Thai fighters stand that way, not great for punching. The only way she feels she can get more weight into the punch is to literally throw herself completely over her front foot. Her back foot will leave the ground. Her rear leg will be completely extended. She'll sometimes fall off balance. In boxing, she used to dive into the clinch a lot. So I'm sure she's going to be not doing that in this fight so as to avoid Rousey's clinch, but that kind of means she can't punch very much. If she's bound and determined not to fall into the clinch, it means that she can't try to sit down on punches. So it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy here. By trying to avoid the clinch, she makes it an inevitability that Rousey will ultimately close the distance.
Yeah, at some point, Rousey is going to end up in her preferred range. And while I do think it's going to take her a few tries to get the fight where she wants it, because, as I mentioned, Holm, strong hips, good at breaking the clinch. I think Holm will throw punches, but they're not going to be effective punches.
They're going to be complete arm punches?
Yeah, they're which is not unuseful for her, Like Joe Rogan seemed puzzled by this in Holm's UFC debut. He's like, she's not really committing to her punches. Well, no, because what she was trying to do was land kicks. She has a tendency of flashing her hands
Yes.
in order to obscure your field of vision and draw your attention away while she sneaks the kicks either under or around your guard. That's what she wants to do. And so a lot of the time she'll flash those hands without committing to it, and that's just fine. She's not trying to do that. She's not really trying to commit to land them hard. In this matchup, it doesn't really help her all that much.
So how does she do that in MMA against a fighter who's coming at her? That's the difficulty, I think, because she's basically never fought an MMA bout with an opponent who is aggressively closing the distance, who is not giving her enough space to kick. And I guess it should be pointed out that she's had 3 kickboxing bouts, and out of that relatively small sample size, she was knocked out in one of those fights. So I think that maybe against a fighter who denies her the range of kicks, there's some evidence to suggest that, if you just don't respect her hands, then are the kicks very effective?
Well, I mean, Pennington had real success in closing the gap against her,
and got some work done in the clinch as well.
Yeah. So I do think it's a possibility. I just think that Holm is going to be so focused on staying away, and I actually do think that Holm has options if she's not flinging herself forward. She's not bad at cutting angles and creating space.
No, and she has stamina. I think that really has to be pointed out. What do you think the chances are of Holm outlasting Rousey? Can Rousey chase after someone who is able to stay away from her for 2 or 3 rounds without gassing out?
Yeah, I think she can. I don't think there's anybody in the world who's going to be more prepared to go 5 rounds who hasn't than Ronda Rousey.
Really?
I think my 2 candidates for that are Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor. People who haven't yet gone 5 rounds who are going to be prepared to do it. Yeah.
Which interesting that both of those are fighters who keep a ridiculous pace.
Yeah, I just think that both of them work so ridiculously hard and are in such good shape that it doesn't even the fact that they have not done so yet does not mean that they can't. But I think that that's what Holm's banking on.
Sure.
That's what she's hoping for.
Well, she's got great endurance. She can go for a long time, and she has before.
Yeah, so, and Holm's coaches, it should be noted, excel at teaching this kind of game plan and have successfully implemented it before.
Sure.
Most notably Carlos Condit versus Nick Diaz. I mean, so I think it's going to look real ugly up into the 2nd or the 3rd round, but eventually Rousey's going to do her thing. And it would not at all surprise me if Rousey just completely knocked her out clean on the feet. When she finally got into her preferred range, Holm felt like she had to throw a couple of punches to keep Rousey off her, and Rousey just clocks her. Because Holm is way hittable when she's in that distance. She doesn't move her head very much. She doesn't carry very well, none of that.
It's all footwork for her, and that's the problem is Rousey has all the options here. So if Rousey gets an advantage in a boxing exchange, she can pursue it wholeheartedly. She has, where even if Holm were to somehow hurt Rousey on the feet, she'd have to be cautious about going for the kill, because Rousey might fling her to the ground, take her down, or at least tie her up or something. And Holm is not going to out-clinch or out-wrestle Ronda Rousey, and so if she's hurt, it's kind of done, unless she can stay away. And I don't know. Rousey's got a killer instinct. I think there probably exists some distant alternate universe in which Holm wins the most unexciting fight in the history of MMA to beat Ronda Rousey. But I think everything has to go perfectly for her. And I think Rousey has to tire out, which I agree. I'm not sure that she necessarily will do. I'm not 100% confident, as you seem to be, that she can go for 5 rounds. But I find it unlikely that she's going to tire out before 3 rounds expires. And how is Holm going to finish her otherwise? So I don't know. It could be ugly. It will be ugly, I think. And I guess that's it. We're both picking Rousey. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a somewhat trollish article this week about how Holly Holm could ruin Ronda Rousey for mainstream fans. Ooh. And I stick by my thesis there. I just think it's going to be a totally awful fight up until the moment that it's not.
Sure.
Just because Holm and Holm's coaches have no interest in making this the kind of fight that anybody wants to watch. You know what I mean?
Sure. Well, they didn't do that for Condit and Diaz either. People were so disappointed in that fight. It kind of turned a lot of fans off of Condit, the natural-born killer who came in. Everyone was calling him the natural-born runner and all that. At least we have reason to expect that from Holly Holm. We know that's what she does on her best day. That is her base style. So hopefully Ronda will come in very well prepared and run her over. Or maybe Holly Holm will make some miraculous change in style and come in and look like the boxer she's always billed as.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think either of us are like super confident in Rousey's coaching, in Rousey's striking coaching, but like the game plan is clear. Like it's not hard to figure out what you have to do here. So hopefully Rousey's coaches have prepared her for that. And like it's not like either of us will blame Holm for trying to play keep away. Like you don't want to fight Ronda Rousey in that range. That's a nut job thing to do.
By all means,
unless you're Chris Cyborg.
You try to make a fight with Rousey entertaining, you end up like Kat Zingano.
Yeah,
the onus is not on you to be fun. The onus is on you to win. So
yeah, there are like two people in the world who can make 135 pounds who are capable maybe of fighting Rousey in her preferred ranges. One of them is Chris Cyborg, and the other is maybe Amanda Nunes.
Yeah, okay, can see that.
And like Holly Holm is not one of those people, and everybody involved would be foolish to either expect that or plan for that.
And the last person I would have said who might fit that bill would have been Alexis Davis. And look what happened.
Yeah, that was, I mean, just devastating.
One of Rousey's most effortless-looking wins. So, Rousey by, what do you say, third, fourth round submission, I think.
Yeah, I'll say third round submission.
Sounds about right. Okay, well, that does it for the Rousey talk. After this, she may very well have run out of opponents unless Chris Cyborg and she can finally work out their differences and arrange a fight. She may have run out of compelling opponents after Holm. Who's the last, I think, billable woman in the division after Rousey has effectively made it look like a wasteland, just like John Jones did to light heavyweight not so long ago. But there are other fights in this card to discuss. Most promising, of course, Joanna Jedrzejczyk making the second defense of her women's strawweight title against Valerie Letourneau, and that is what we are going to be talking about after this break. Okay, wait, stop. Don't skip this break. I know you skip most of them. It's a podcast. It's not a radio show. You don't have to listen to the commercials. But if you follow my very simple instructions, you'll be doing a huge service to Heavy Hands, Pat, and myself. First, go to Stitcher.com or iTunes.com. You can use either of those services to subscribe to the show, which makes it really, really easy to listen to every episode and not have to go hunting for it on our confusing, badly designed website. Once you're there, give us a positive rating and a positive review. That means go to the little 5-star thing and click on the star all the way to the right. That's a 5-star rating. That's the best one you could possibly give us. And like 20 or 30 words about how you enjoy the show. It may not seem like much, but it's a huge help to us, and we really appreciate it. It helps us bring Heavy Hands to an ever-increasing audience, which is just good for everybody. So thank you for listening. Please take the time to give us a positive rating and review. Next time that you're on at your computer, at your phone, whatever, iTunes.com, Stitcher.com, search for Heavy Hands, give a positive rating and a review. Thank you. And now, back to the show. And we're back. Valerie Letourneau fighting Joanna Jedrzejczyk. Jedrzejczyk's second defense of her UFC strawweight title, which she won a couple of years ago, not even just like a year ago now, against Carla Esparza.
It was only in March of 2015. It seems like a lot longer.
It does. Doesn't it? Seems like her personality is so powerful, so pervasive. It seems like she's been around for a long time. Very new.
She is delightful, and we love her.
She is delightful. As a person, very interesting to listen to. As a fighter, terrifyingly wonderful to behold. Just a real treat for anybody who enjoys MMA, particularly striking. And Valerie Letourneau, I guess we should point out that in the first place, Letourneau is the opponent here because Claudia Gadelha had to pull out of a fight that probably would have been a qualifier for the Jedrzejczyk rematch. A fight back in, was it the one in Poland or one in Berlin?
Well, so
the Scotland
a couple
card.
of things happened. So she had to pull out of a fight with Randa Marcos, she had to pull out of a fight with Aisling Daly or Randa Marcos on that Poland card in April. But then she just beat the ever-loving crap out of Jessica Aguilar at UFC 190, and so she was supposed to get her title shot. That was supposed to be a title eliminator. But she has some sort of hand injury or thumb injury. She was forced to push it back. I think the plan was always for Jedrzejczyk to be fighting on Ronda Rousey's next card.
Yes.
When that got moved up to November, they weren't going to wait and not put Jedrzejczyk on that card because it's just too big an opportunity to expose her to Ronda Rousey's fans.
Yeah, and so without Gadelha, who is the best fight in the division right now for Jedrzejczyk. They had such a competitive initial fight before Jedrzejczyk became the champ. In lieu of that fight, they have basically decided to give her a fighter who cannot possibly compete with Jedrzejczyk other than in her chosen realm of fighting. She has to strike with Jedrzejczyk because she's just not a very good wrestler, and she's not a very good grappler either. And so basically, she is to Joanna Jedrzejczyk, Valerie Letourneau is, what Liz Carmouche was to Ronda Rousey on her first main event appearance for the UFC.
Yeah, precisely. That's a fantastic kind of parallel for this because it exactly mirrors it. Like Letourneau knows how to shoot a double, and she knows how to do some work from top position. Mm-hmm. It's not like she's a complete novice there.
No.
But she's not good enough at either of those things to make Jedrzejczyk worry about them. She's certainly not as good at either of those things as Jessica Penne was, or as Carla.
To the point that I wouldn't be surprised to see Jedrzejczyk actually out wrestle her if she wanted to.
Yeah, she could easily take Valerie Letourneau down if she wanted to,
yeah.
I think. So that means that this is going to play out as a striking matchup. And Letourneau is not a bad fighter. I think we need to make sure that we get that across here.
No.
She's a pretty good striker in this division, and she's a very well-trained striker. She's got good coaches. She knows how to execute a game plan. But she's just miles and miles and miles behind where Jedrzejczyk.
She's also riding a much better series of wins than Liz Carmouche was at the time of the Rousey fight.
Correct.
She beat Elizabeth Phillips back at bantamweight, made the insane cut along with former bantamweight Jessica Rakoczy and beat Rakoczy. And then she beat Marina Moroz, who we really thought was going to win that fight, and she beat her very impressively. She knocked her down. She did do some nice grappling from top position. Of course, Moroz is infamously willing to fight off of her back, so that we certainly won't be seeing that in the Jedrzejczyk fight. But she fought a great fight, and I guess we should really talk about what developments or what strategic sort of elements we saw in that bout. As a way of preparing for what we can expect Letourneau to bring in the Joanna Champion fight. So what did we see in the Moroz fight? First of all, was a lot of really good work with range against Moroz, who is at her best on the feet a pocket boxer. Not necessarily a perfectly technical one, but a relatively powerful one, and a pretty comfortable one who throws combinations. And over the course of the fight, Letourneau did a fantastic job of fighting her off in the pocket and then following her out of range, hitting her when Moroz thought she was safe, or hitting Moroz in the spaces between attacks.
Yeah, precisely. And she did that with two tools. This is really the bread and butter of Letourneau's game, is the straight right hand followed by the left kick, or alternatively the left kick followed by the straight right hand.
Yeah.
That's really what she's got. She throws a lovely left hook, but she could stand to use it a lot more often than she does. When she closes the door with her left hook, I think that's actually the best. I think that's actually her best punch. But she is extremely right hand oriented. She's got a really nice jab, but it's kind of inconsistent. It kind of comes and goes. But really, it's that straight right left kick that's her bread and butter. Why? Because the left kick catches you as you circle out, as you think you're safe there.
Yeah, she's almost on the feet a less refined version of like a Rashid Magomedov, who we'll probably be talking about in the next segment because he fought last weekend. She's got a pretty educated left hand for a fighter in this division. We don't have a lot of great strikers here, hence why Jedrzejczyk has been able to just so brutally feast on the grapplers that she's been put up against so far. But even among that crop, Letourneau's pretty good with that left hand. She maintains distance. She fires it off on a hair trigger when the opponent comes in. I think when it gets into prolonged exchanges in the pocket, we start to see the issue. Do you think that she will be able to fight off the back foot and keep Jedrzejczyk from cutting her off?
Absolutely not. Huh?
Yeah.
That to me is the kind of the crux of this matchup. Is Letourneau is willing to bang it out in the pocket to get back to the ranges that she would rather operate at. And I think that's going to be her downfall here, is she's going to get drawn into exchanges that she can't win.
A little bit of an Anthony Pettis there.
She's not good defensively in the pocket. That's really the issue, is she relies heavily on her toughness and her straight up willingness to throw back. But her head stays right on the center line. She's not particularly good defensively with either her hand placement or her parries. And so she's just kind of there to be hit. And you cannot be there to be hit against Ioana Jedrzejczyk.
And
That's just a recipe for disaster.
She's a relatively poor combination puncher compared to how effective her initial salvos are. I think she's one of those fighters where the more punches she throws, the more off balance she gets, the more out of position her feet get, the less weight. And, it's kind of like a weightlifter. You'll find out how good a weightlifter's lifting form really is when you get him to do 15 reps of a heavy weight. And you start to see it fall apart under duress. And for Letourneau, the punching form, the flaws really become apparent when she has to go beyond those first 2 punches or so.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of the time you see her right foot, after she throws her right hand, you see her right foot come forward to the point where she's in an almost square stance.
Yeah.
And then a lot of the time she has to throw her right hand again with like an adjustment step backwards just to get back into her normal stance.
Yeah.
And you cannot do that in the pocket with a combination puncher like Jedrzejczyk because she's going to hit you in a spot where your body can't take the impact.
It works great when you're trying to walk into a left kick. When you're trying to walk that right foot forward to make it your pivot point for the left kick. But I don't expect that we'll see Jedrzejczyk willingly taking many steps backward and giving her the space to step forward into a kick. And if she smothers her or steps into her or even just stands her ground as Letourneau's foot floats forward, she's in a very vulnerable position. Let's celebrate Ioana Jedrzejczyk and talk about what we expect to see from her in this matchup. If Letourneau does fight off the back foot, what do we expect Jedrzejczyk to show?
Well, I think the first and foremost, just that unbelievably piercing jab. She throws a really vicious telephone pole-like jab, both to the head and the body. She throws it with an unpredictable rhythm. She throws it both from kind of her normal stance and as a leaping jab. She's got a lot of variations on it. Speaking of educated left hands, Jedrzejczyk's is fantastic.
Yes.
The left hook is Jedrzejczyk's kind of bread and butter punch. It's probably her best punch. And she plays the threat of that jab together with the threat of the left hook to move her opponent's hands and head around in predictable ways that opens up the threat of the other.
She does also like to throw the left hook just as kind of a slap in order to set up the right hand. She will just guide her opponent into her other punches. So I think that one of the best things about Jedrzejczyk as a pressure fighter, and she has often been forced to fight as a pressure fighter recently against opponents who do not want to come forward against her on the feet, and many of them thought they wanted to come forward until running into a few combinations, and then they turn into an outfighter, whether they wanted to or not. But what we've seen from Jedrzejczyk is her ability to, as you said, change up her targets and set up combinations, set up later punches with early ones very intelligently. And so we've seen an increased reliance on that left hook. We've seen her using the left hook to set up the right hand. We've seen her threatening both of those punches to set up what is a really, really solid left hook to the body. We also saw in that last fight with Jessica Penne the kicks. The kicks, which had more or less vanished from Jedrzejczyk's game, because you wouldn't know that she came from a Muay Thai background unless you heard it from Mike Goldberg and Joe Rogan every broadcast. You'd think she was a boxer, the way she's been fighting since coming to the UFC. But
I think that was purely a function of her being worried about her takedown defense. Against 3 fighters, her first 3 opponents in the UFC were all people who relied heavily on shot takedowns, on takedowns that involved grabbing your legs. Juliana Lima, despite the fact that she has a Muay Thai pedigree, is mostly a wrestler, and mostly a wrestler who relies on singles and doubles. Claudia Gadelha has excellent shot takedowns and catches kicks pretty well. Carla Esparza, again, a wrestler who relies heavily on shot takedowns and has caught kicks in the past. That's a thing that she's good at. So it's easy to see from the perspective of Jedrzejczyk's coaches and her game plans why you think, okay, if we can just beat these people with our hands and worry solely about defending takedowns, then let's do that. But against Jessica Penne, who gets all of her takedowns from the clinch, and not just from the clinch, but from the head and arm throw. That's what Jessica Penne does. You don't really need to worry all that much about kicking her. So finally, we saw the Ernesto Hoost trained striker in Jedrzejczyk come out. We saw the beautiful, gorgeous punch kick combinations. The timing on them when Penne put her weight down on her lead leg, that was when Jedrzejczyk kicked her. The angles, the beautiful angles, stepping across, pulling her head off the center line to avoid the counter right hand as she stepped in. I mean, just unbelievably clean technique. You
know what else stood out to me in that Jessica Penne fight? The crazy punch flurries. the punch elbow flurries in an effort to force the finish, because that was how she finished Carla Esparza. And that is the moment that gets replayed most from the Carla Esparza fight, because I think it looks, I guess I'll be a snob here and say to the untrained eye, I think it looks at first impression like some kind of Super Saiyan crazy Street Fighter combo. When it's mostly just open hands hitting the guard.
That's directed entirely at the referee.
Right. Exactly. But I like that. I at one point, sometimes I don't like it. I saw her fighting Penny. I'm like, nah, just hit her. You want just punch her instead of slapping away at her guard. But I also like that Jedrzejczyk fights like a very experienced fighter. She has an element of gamesmanship or trying to kind of get one over on the system. She's not afraid to grind her forearm in your face or drag her fingers across your eyes if she's in the clinch. She's not afraid to push you around and be kind of dirty. She's not afraid to kind of play games with the mind of the ref, Henan Barao versus Uriah Faber style, and try to compel the referee to stop it by going crazy with something that looks good but isn't really doing anything.
Yeah, it's a big part of what makes her as good as she is. Like, you and I have talked about this a number of times before on this show, about how what separates very good fighters from elite fighters a lot of the time isn't athleticism and it isn't technique. It's that little bit of extra competitiveness and oomph.
Yeah.
And the ability to find just that tiny little extra edge, whatever it is. So for Jose Aldo, it's a lot of the time a willingness to grab the cage, things like that. It's that little bit of extra competitive fire. It's not wanting to be beaten at anything. Like there's nothing wrong with Conor McGregor's takedown defense in some of his Cage Warriors fights, but he would still grab the cage. Why? Because he didn't want to concede a takedown even for a second.
Yeah, sure.
It's just a little bit of extra competitive oomph that makes you that much better.
Sure.
But so in this fight, Conor, what do you expect from Jedrzejczyk? What do you think the outcome is going to be here?
Well, I think it kind of depends on what we see from Letourneau. Will we see Letourneau trying to... Because I think Letourneau must recognize, though I'm sure she will try to mix in some takedowns just to make things interesting. She's an ATT fighter. They tend to do that. I think she does recognize that she has to strike, for the most part, with Jedrzejczyk. I think it would be an absurd fantasy for her to come in here thinking that she's going to out-grapple Jedrzejczyk when Claudia Gadelha struggled to, and when Carla Esparza just couldn't. So... my question here is whether or not she tries to fight off the back foot, expecting Jedrzejczyk to be a pressure fighter, which she has often been, or whether she tries to come forward opportunistically. In which case, I think we'll get to see Jedrzejczyk's counter-striking, which I think is pretty underrated. We saw some of that when she fought Gadelha, because Gadelha fought her pretty aggressively, and it's really good. The one thing I'm going to be looking out for this time, though, is Jedrzejczyk's footwork. I don't think she is a fantastic defensive fighter in terms of like the subtlety of her defensive technique. She doesn't have a lot of head movement. She has some little subtle movements, like you mentioned before, with pulling the head offline during kicks, things like that. But mostly she cuts very good pivots. She cuts very small angles in close in order to keep the opponent from running straight through her. And if Letourneau comes forward, I'm going to be looking for those. If Letourneau tries to fight on the outside, then I'm going to be looking for Jedrzejczyk's ring-cutting footwork, using side steps and attacking on diagonals. I think that's one of the hardest things to understand when you first start trying to cut off the cage, or even if you've been doing it for a long time, and then you come up against an opponent with really good evasive lateral movement, good misdirection, is that you cannot only be able to move side to side or forward and backward. You have to be able to combine the two. You have to be able to attack diagonally, covering side-to-side distance while covering forward distance, or vice versa, while doing it backwards, taking an angle while retreating and letting the other person run past you while you step to the side and prepare a counter.
Yeah, and I think that in the latter case, if she's forced to pressure, I think we'll see a lot more kicks. I think that but to speak to the issue of Jedrzejczyk's defense, I think she's really a Dutch stylist in that sense, that she relies a lot on keeping a tight guard. She relies a lot on those small movements and subtle adjustments of distance. Like we did an entire show back in, I think, June, where we talked about Joanna Jedrzejczyk's small steps and how precise and efficient her footwork is. Yeah, because in the Dutch style, you really don't see a lot of head movement. I think that that's about the most Dutch style thing about Jedrzejczyk's game. is what she looks like in the pocket.
Yeah.
And you tend to rely on a shell guard in that style of pocket fighting. It's just what you do. It's the same thing with Nikki Holtzkin, who's I think one of the most talented strikers on the face of the planet. That you just don't see a lot of it, even among dedicated pocket fighters.
Sure. He's not Artem Levin.
Yeah, exactly. It's a totally different kind of tradition to come from. But so yeah, I think you're right. That is the basic dynamic of this fight, is what Letourneau wants to do.
Yeah.
I think Jedrzejczyk has a tendency to be pretty reactive about that. She's willing to let you try your stuff out, and then she'll come back with the appropriate response.
I agree. That's why I think we've seen so much pressure fighting from her. But if I had to categorize her, I think I'd call her a boxer puncher. I think when given the opportunity, she's always happy to stand her ground and fire back. You know, she doesn't counter like she's waiting for the perfect opportunity. She counters more like Jimmy Rivera did to Pedro Munoz. Just hair trigger counterfighting, where she will throw the moment you come into range and start trying to threaten her and leave yourself open. And I think that kind of demonstrates that inherent confidence that we've always identified as being the central aspect that defines a fighter as a boxer puncher, and also just the willingness to do whatever the fight demands. If she is against an aggressive opponent, she'll take steps back and she'll cut angles and she will counter, and she'll swing away in the pocket if she needs to. If she's against an opponent who is retreating, then she will be a very effective pressure fighter, and her skills in that area have only improved, I think, since fighting Claudia Gadelha. So, but really, I mean, I almost feel bad for Letourneau here, but we're kind of talking about this in the same way we talked about the Rousey fight. It's more a how will Jedrzejczyk beat Letourneau more so than it is how will Letourneau, give Jedrzejczyk trouble.
Well, the other kind of sick aspect of this, if we're talking about this from the perspective of Valeria Letourneau, is it's not just that Jedrzejczyk is really good; it's that she gets demonstrably better in every single fight.
Yeah.
So the version of Jedrzejczyk that we saw against Jessica Penne, who frankly looked unstoppable and looked like maybe the cleanest technical striker in MMA, depending on how you want to define that, that she's almost certainly going to look better against Letourneau than she did against Penne, because her combinations looked better, her timing was better, her hand speed was better, she was faster on her feet, all of this, than she was when she fought Carla Esparza. Like, she didn't overcommit to her punches the way that she did a couple of times against Esparza early.
Yeah.
She was much more measured. So if that's what she looked like in a 3-month gap between those two fights, what's she going to look like now, having had 4.5 months to train for this?
And I think most importantly, if we're thinking about this fight as kind of just a stay busy performance, a get over fight before the Gadelha rematch, which will ultimately happen. In that Penne fight, Jedrzejczyk looked better at fighting in transitions and on breaks, which was the key skill that helped her to beat Esparza for the title. And against Penne, who wasn't even trying to close a distance as aggressively, Jedrzejczyk did a fantastic job. There was one combination, I think it was in the first round of the fight, where Jedrzejczyk stepped in and Penne threw at her, and she turned a little angle, just a very short pivot, used a left hook to blind Penne, and then came up with a short right uppercut while Penne was like falling into the clinch, and Penne staggered and fell to her back. She hit her with a nasty elbow that opened a pretty horrible gash on her nose. She's just gotten really good at finding those tiny little openings for strikes while the opponent is trying to get away. And while we did celebrate how well Letourneau did that against Moroz, she doesn't do it nearly as well as Jedrzejczyk. And that's kind of the story of this matchup, is that Letourneau will have to fight Jedrzejczyk's fight, and she just doesn't do anything as well as Jedrzejczyk.
Yep, I'm with that.
It's the brutal reality. What's your prediction? Let's go ahead and call the round and method.
I'm going to say Jedrzejczyk by knockout about 3 minutes into the second round.
Second round, you think?
Yeah, I don't think it's gonna take her very long. I think Jedrzejczyk is happy to kind of take the first round slowly. It's generally the last minute of the first round and the first couple of minutes of the second round when you see her output start to creep up. Like she'll throw 12 to 15 strikes a minute for about the first 4 minutes, and this is consistent across her fights. But when she gets into the late into the first round and into the second, it creeps up to about 20, and then when she really starts to find a range, it's 25 to 30.
Sure, I think maybe third round. I got to give Letourneau credit for her toughness. She can really take a beating, And while she is the only fighter so far who is going to have to strike with Jedrzejczyk, she's not the only one who ended up having to strike with Jedrzejczyk. For all the praise we've given Joanna, she's not a tremendously hard hitter.
I don't know, man. I think she's getting harder. I think she's becoming a harder puncher. Like
maybe. I think she hits about as hard as Fabio Maldonado for his division. Like Maldonado has pop, but it takes attrition for them to start really adding up. And she throws more volume than Maldonado, so it sometimes happens a little more dramatically. But boy, did Penne eat a lot of punches before ultimately, and she stayed on her feet. And even Esparza was not completely out when Jedrzejczyk hasn't really knocked anybody out cold. You know what I mean?
That's a fair statement. Okay, I'll concede the point.
She's not an ineffective puncher. I mean, don't ever take this as any kind of slight to Joanna Jedrzejczyk, because I make sure my girlfriend isn't like standing behind me every time I check out her fights on Fight Pass, because I just love her so much. She's just so much fun to watch. But I don't think she's like that venomous of a puncher. She's just the best puncher in the division.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm with you.
Okay. Well, we've got some fights from last weekend to cover in the final segment. I'm not sure quite exactly what we'll be talking about, but my suspicions are Rashid Magomedov, Jimmy Rivera, and maybe a couple other fights from what ended up being a fantastic night of fights.
Tomas Almeida.
Of course, Tomas Almeida.
Come on here, Connor.
How could I have forgotten Tomas Almeida as well? We've got a lot of fantastic performances from all the wonderful prospects we had performing last weekend, so we will be giving you the recap of that right after this. Okay, so here's another way you can help us out. Go to your couch, lift up the cushions, and scrounge around in the creases for change, lint, like bent paper clips, like a thumbtack that you stab your thumb on and then you scream alone in your living room. Throw all the stuff out except the change. All right, now take that and deposit it into your bank account or your PayPal account. Head over to heavyhandspodcast.com and click on the donate button on the right side of your screen. Whatever money you just found, which you weren't using anyway, send it to us, all right? Because Pat and I will use it. That money helps us keep this show on the air and free of charge, which is great for you. It's great for us because that way we're making a little bit of money. The donations are a huge deal for us. So please go to heavyhandspodcast.com. Any spare change that you might have lying around, hit the donate button on the right side of the screen and send it our way to help us keep this show live. Thanks. And now back to Heavy Hands. Okay, so to make up for the fact that I almost forgot him, let's talk about Tomas Almeida first. He fought Anthony Burchak last weekend, UFC Fight Night 77 in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Pat, both you and I expected this to be a very tough fight for him.
Yeah, and it really was not nearly as tough as either you or I thought it would be.
I don't think I would even...
the third round, and you thought the second, right?
Yeah, and I don't think I would even call it a tough fight.
I think he got... Yeah, I think he ate a couple of shots, but far fewer than he has in the past. I mean, I was telling you off air, Connor, this fight allayed a lot of the concerns that I've had about Almeida as a longtime observer of his.
Yeah.
I've watched all of Almeida's fights going back to like 2012. Everything that's been available on him, I have watched. I've watched every publicly available Tomas Almeida fight, and the concerns have been roughly the same: that he's a relatively slow starter, that he's not nearly as bad a defensive fighter as some of his critics seem to think he is, who focus on how much he gets hit rather than the rate at which he gets hit.
Yeah.
So, but for about the first 4 minutes of a fight, 3-4 minutes of a fight, Almeida has historically been quite hittable. And then, he starts to get his range, his head movement turns on, he starts to string together his head movement, his parries, and his blocks in the pocket. And suddenly it's not nearly as much of a problem. In this fight, he fought much more cautiously at first. It took him a little while to get his range. We didn't see his trademark volume. But then once he got there, he turned it on and he was a killer.
I think it was a great approach because I think part of the reason why he's been so hittable before has been his all-out determination to fight in his ideal range at all costs. And so against a guy like Brad Pickett, for example, in his last fight, that was very, very dangerous to be diving into boxing range because really, at his best, Almeida is a boxer. Like a pocket boxer, mid-range, maybe close enough to grab a clinch, but really he wants to land those combinations, left hook to the body, low kick as you step away, short right hand, elbows, things like that. And he didn't do that against Burchak. It was a very wise decision because Burchak is very dangerous in the clinch. He's very dangerous in mid-range. And I think it's particularly impressive because one of the real things I was worried about here for Almeida's sake was how weird and unpredictable Birchak's striking can be. When he caught Joe Soto, it was with just a very bizarre, not a completely unheard of strike. Lyoto Machida does these all the time, but he went for a clinch knee, and then as Soto stepped back, hit him with a punch from the same side from which he threw the knee before he'd even set his foot back down. Just a weirdly timed strike, and he does a lot of that. Sort of bizarre improvised striking on the fly, things that you might not necessarily see while preparing for an opponent in the gym. And so it could be a lot of problems. I foresaw that could be a real problem for Almeida, who has historically been kind of hittable. He didn't really get hit that much at all. Like I really hesitate to call it even a tough fight by Almeida standards, because I think he had a harder time with Tim Gorman in his UFC debut. And Gorman's not even in the UFC anymore. Not that he's a bad fighter, but...
He did, yeah. I mean, so Birchak landed less than 20% of the strikes that he threw to Almeida's head.
Yes.
In that fight.
Pretty good defensive numbers.
Or landed just over 20%.
Especially by MMA, where we tend to see a lot higher percentages than in boxing.
Yeah, exactly. Because smaller gloves, less head movement, a lot of reasons for that. But like, Birchak is a lethal athlete. Like, he is an unbelievably explosive guy, and you saw. I think you saw that in this fight where Almeida, who normally looks like a very plus athlete, who is a quick mover, Birchak made him look fairly average in terms of raw speed.
Yeah,
that really stood out to me when I was watching this fight. And Almeida responded the way that you should to a situation like that. You let that guy show you what he's got.
Yes.
And then once you figured him out, then you go in for it. But he avoided Birchak's wheelhouse. He avoided the clinch for the most part, which is where Birchak is incredibly dangerous. Birchak is a ridiculous clinch and transitional in and out of the clinch kind of striker, and Almeida avoided that. It was a smart fight. It was a really smart fight, and you like seeing that from Almeida.
Absolutely, and we lauded him on last week's show for the maturity, and we basically said that he fights like a more experienced fighter than he is in how well he adapts. That was one of the things we liked about him. I think this goes even far and beyond that, because he didn't force the adaptations. He didn't put himself in a situation where he needed to adapt. This really kind of showed veteran savvy at such a young age, that he was just going to find out what he needed to do at his leisure. You know, he didn't. There was no point in that fight where it was like, oh, he needs to adjust to what Birchak is showing him.
Yeah, exactly. It was exceptionally impressive. So, yeah. I mean, just kind of before we wrap up talking about Almeida, what do you think is his ceiling, Connor? How high do you think he can go in this division?
I don't know, man. I don't know. Even his takedown defense isn't flawless, but he never ever gets held down. He's almost as good as natural as a guy like Jose Aldo in popping back to his feet, or like Rashid Magomedov, who we'll be talking about next. He hits the ground like a spring. He's shifting his hips, then switching directions, shifting them the other way, knocking the guy on top of him off balance, grabbing a whizzer, and he's got space and he's up to his feet. He doesn't even give up his back in the process, not easily anyway. So I think with a guy with his striking potential, whose defense I can only imagine to get better, who's now showing an ability to fight kind of cautiously but still get a first round knockout, I kind of think the sky's the limit for him. Like I would not be surprised if within the next year we see him fighting TJ Dillashaw. And personally, I wouldn't like it to happen that soon, to risk kind of killing off his rise. But I wouldn't be surprised at all if he runs through some real top 10 fighters in this next year.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you're a matchmaker, you keep him away from somebody like Brian Caraway at all costs.
Sure.
Because there's no upside for you in that fight.
Sure.
That's just a uniquely bad matchup. I think Aljamain Sterling is a really tough matchup for him because of Almeida's because Almeida can be taken down and then forced to scramble back to his feet. That's a really weird space for him to fight in against somebody like Sterling, who excels in those spaces.
Boy, that'd be a fascinating fight, though.
It would be, yeah, and so would I would love to see him fight Dominic Cruz at some point. But I tend to think that Almeida is actually a uniquely difficult matchup for TJ Dillashaw because of his comfort in the pocket.
Yeah, the only reason I say I wouldn't like to see it is not because I don't think that a fighter like Almeida couldn't beat Dillashaw someday. I think it would be too soon if you were to fight him within the next year. I mean, you never know. He's 24. We have seen fighters become great at 25 before. So it could be just a crazy standout year. He could have a John Jones run. But, I wouldn't risk it if I was a matchmaker.
Yeah, I mean, it would not at all surprise me if he were being told to stay in shape just in case a certain oft-injured former bantamweight champion is not ready to go in January. It would not surprise me at all if he were being told to stay in the gym. But I hope that doesn't happen. I hope that he gets, like you, I mean, I've been following this guy for a long time. I feel like I've got something personally invested in him. I hope he gets a little more time to develop.
Yeah. So real quickly, because we did talk about the process of developing prospects on last week's episode, who would you like to see Tomas Almeida fight next?
Oh man, there aren't a ton of options for him. Like just slightly above him. Selfishly, what I would like to see. I don't think that this will happen. I think for me, I would give him the winner of the Uriah Faber-Frankie Saenz fight, basically to get Almeida over. I think that Faber is at that point in his career where he's not going on another title run. He started to decline, but he's still got a lot of shine that he could give to somebody as young and talented as Almeida.
Sure. I think if you're not looking for such a quick get-over fight, I think probably the most winnable top 10 opponent from right now might actually be one of my favorites, Takeya Mizugaki. Mm-hmm. I think he could take out...
I actually just think Almeida's past that. I think he's past that point.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's not really any depth there at bantamweight besides that. Mizugaki's number 6 on SureDog's rankings right now.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, who else is there in this division?
Yeah, I don't know. But so kind of in general. So one more. So before we get out of here, Rashid Magomedov, Gilbert Burns.
Yes. Holy hell! Just a pleasure to watch. I struggled to explain. Watched the fight with my girlfriend, and she was in that second round. She's like, "What's he doing? Why is he not finishing him?" I said, "I don't know, but it doesn't ruin my enjoyment of the fight at all. It's just not in Magomedov's nature." To go for the kill. You know, he's such a cautious fighter, and I can understand completely why some would be really, really frustrated that he had Burns as hurt as he did, and boy did he have him hurt, and just didn't really make a concerted effort to finish him off when he probably could have.
It's really funny to me. Now, Brian Stan has called Magomedov's, I think Brian Stan has definitely called his last 2 fights, and I think maybe his last 3. Just his last 2. But it seems to personally bother Brian Stan that Rashid Magomedov doesn't go for the finish.
Yeah.
And I think that's because Brian Stan was such a killer of a finisher himself.
Yeah.
That it bothers him on like a personal level that Magomedov can't bring himself to do more to get the finish.
Yeah.
But so with that said, yeah, it doesn't really ruin my enjoyment either, especially because Gilbert Burns is such a tough dude.
Yes. And so dangerous. You don't want to follow him to the ground.
Yeah, you're talking about a legitimate, not like he's not out there winning Naga titles. Like Gilbert Burns is a legit 4-time world jiu-jitsu champion. You don't want to be on the mat with him if you can possibly avoid it. I tend to think that that's smart. Magomedov is just a smart fighter. He may lack a little bit of urgency, but it certainly doesn't make me enjoy it.
Yeah, at times as a fighter you can be smart to a fault. At times, sure. It is the smartest, safest decision to get the guy out of there when you have the chance. You know, you always risk that line. Like, if you're tired, do you completely blow your wad trying to finish the guy and gas yourself out? Or do you wait and give him a chance to come back and beat you because you're exhausted? There's always a fine line there. It's a razor's edge. But, I mean, it's Magomedov, once it almost enhances my enjoyment of Magomedov in a weird, probably hipsterish way, because I see Magomedov as a fighter who effortlessly hurts opponents. Like, I don't think he's out there trying to knock anybody's heads off or trying to go crazy. He has yet to have a UFC fight in which he hasn't badly hurt an opponent, even though he's only stopped one of them. He just, without trying, manages to almost knock out everybody he fights. And I love that because it really speaks to the depth of his craft. And I can't wait to see him get a top 10 matchup too. Who would you match him up with next?
I think I would match him. I don't know that they will do this, but I would match him with the winner of Barboza Ferguson. Because I think that the winner of that fight, assuming it's Ferguson, is going to be in line for a title shot if Khabib can't go in the near future. To me, I think it has to be somebody who's high up there. Magomedov is already 31. He's a finished product. The time is now to push him into those kinds of matchups. But just in general, for me, Magomedov embodies a concept that I talk about a lot on this show, which is process. His process is ultrasound.
Yes.
Like what you talked about with him having hurt all of his opponents, That's because he does it right every time.
Yeah.
He can finish opponents. We know that he can hurt opponents, but it's not necessary for him to do that to win fights. He doesn't sell out for things. He doesn't have to land the power punches. He's got multiple ways of winning fights, and you know that every fight, what you're going to get from him is technically sound. It works. It works against multiple different kinds of opponents, whether you want to grapple with him or whether you want to strike with him. He can win both of those. It's just very, very sound.
Yeah, even though he has a few particular tools that stand out as kind of his highlight weapons, his standbys, he finds a different way to use them depending on each opponent, depending on really what's in front of him. He adapts very, very well. You know, when he fought Elias Silverio, it was the left kick and the left hook as counters while moving away, Silverio trying to come after him. When he fought Gilbert Burns here, those were really setting up the right hand over the shoulder as Burns was shooting his jab out there from too far away, or keeping a kind of a lazy jab. And knowing Burns, he needed his hand there to block. He needed it back, so countering him off the jab was a perfect opportunity. He always just seems to find the surest way of getting his strikes to land, no matter who he's fighting, while fighting off takedowns, and again, while hurting everybody. Nobody fights Rashid Magomedov and comes away unscathed, it seems.
Yeah, exceptionally dangerous in kind of an understated way.
Yeah.
One of your and my favorite fighters. Gotta love him.
Absolutely. Well, that just about does it for today's episode. Before we wrap up, you want to tell the people at home what you've got coming out this week?
So I've got a complete guide to UFC 193, everything you need to know about it, coming out on Bleacher Report tomorrow. And then Friday, I've got a piece that I've been working on for a very long time, coming out on Bleacher Report, entitled How the UFC Made Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey Stars. It's a deep dive into the UFC's publicity machine and how they've become like a real live professional entertainment conglomerate in the last couple of years.
And I've been hearing about this piece behind the scenes for several weeks now. I'm looking forward to reading it. I also have a complete breakdown of the card coming out tomorrow. Would you believe it, Pat?
That's funny how that works, isn't it?
This just keeps happening. We both just keep having these previews. I've got the preview of UFC 193 coming up on SureDog. I gotta say, not a great card, top to bottom.
Yeah, it's funny. Like they're about 4 really good fights, and then the rest of it is pretty much like filler for the local audience.
Pretty much, the rest of it looks like not even a great Bellator card. Just like who do we have? Who's from Australia? Put them on here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this: I'm a big fan, in kind of a hipsterish way, of Richard Filthy Rich Walsh fighting on the Fight Pass prelims. He's a fighter I enjoy a lot. The opening Fight Pass prelim between Ben Nguyen and Ryan Benoit is going to be a firecracker.
That's going to be the best, most entertaining fight on the whole undercard.
I'm sorry?
That'll probably be the most entertaining fight on the whole undercard.
Yeah, look for that to make its way onto the pay-per-view broadcast. It almost certainly will.
Oh, yeah, no doubt. If we get some early finishes, sure. What else do I have coming out? Something. Oh, I'm probably going to be writing a very difficult article on how Holly Holm can beat Ronda Rousey. I enjoy challenging myself.
Yeah, you're going to have to dig deep into the old well on that one.
I think it'll be even harder than when I tried to game plan for John Dodson against Mighty Mouse, not because Rousey is as good as Mighty Mouse, but because the disparity in skill level here is much wider than it was then. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult, not necessarily skill, but just potency. It's hard to see Holly Holm being potent enough to beat Ronda Rousey, but I'm going to try my best to come up with that strategy, so we'll see how it goes. And I think that's just about it. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We're looking forward to the fights. We hope you guys enjoyed our breakdowns. Ioane and Jedrzejczyk should give us lots of action for us to reminisce over, just in case the Holly Holm Ronda Rousey fight ends up being as boring as we expect it to be. We'll have to wait and see when the fights actually play out on Saturday, the 14th. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been yet another episode of Heavy Hands.